Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, we're going to be breaking down some important quotations according to theme and character for the novel Brave New World. So before we get into the actual quotations and how they link to theme and character, just a small note on what an ideal quote to use with regards to writing your essay. So remember, an ideal quote to use is, I would say, between 5 to 8 words. Now, this is not like a rule or anything, but this would be my advice because that is a sufficient amount of information that you're showing your marker that you've studied, but also it has enough there for you to actually say something distinctive, say something credible, and say something that's going to add to the argument that you're trying to present in your essay. So when you are thinking about memorizing quotations, try and find quotations that link to multiple characters or multiple themes that can be used in a variety of scenarios, because obviously you don't know what your essay topic is going to be beforehand. Some of the quotes that we're going to use in this video are quite long, and my suggestion is to highlight a short quote within that long quote. And then I would definitely suggest as well that you have a look at my video on how to integrate quotations. So once you have a good list of quotes, or even before you generate that list, understanding how to integrate your quotes and things like avoiding personal pronouns in quotations, because it's not going to sort of work well within the sentence. So make sure you watch that video when you are preparing your quotations, and also when you're working on integrating your quotes into your essay. So we'll start off with Bernard Marx, our protagonist, our main character in Brave New World, and a quote that is a really good quote that matches him and that encapsulates a lot of his identity, but also the reason why he makes certain decisions, right? It gives us that reasoning. A chronic fear of being slighted made him avoid his equals. So remember, Bernard is part of the alphas, but he is slightly different. And in this society, being different is not something that is celebrated. In this society, efficiency and uniformity are celebrated. And so this makes Bernard feel inferior. So this is seen, internally, he feels that he is inferior, but then also other people sort of maybe look down on him a little bit because he's not fitting within the societal parameters. And this is a really important aspect of his character and identity, because this prompts him to act against the society, which he does in a number of ways, but also in a sort of contradictory fashion, he's still trying to fit into the society. So there's this duality to this character, because as much as he's trying to go against it because he doesn't feel like he fits in, at the same time he envies those who are able to fit in. So really interesting character there with the duality, and depending on what you're writing your essay on, you can use either side to him, or you could use both sides to him. Next we have Lenina. I don't understand anything, she said with decision, determined to preserve her incomprehension intact. So this is a really interesting line, and Lenina is a really interesting character, especially as a foil to Bernard. So Lenina is someone who fits in within the society, and she appreciates the societal parameters and the conditioning that has been put in place. So she is someone who revels in the system, in the systematic nature. And we see that when she goes to the savage reservation, she's absolutely out of her depth, and she's really struggles to deal with it and really struggles to comprehend it. So she, is feeding off the indoctrination that the conditioning has given her, and she doesn't want to think beyond that. She doesn't want to challenge the system. So the conditioning has sort of worked on her 100% as it was intended, as it's supposed to. Next, we have John the Savage. He had discovered time and death and God. Now, this is the character that to me is the most interesting character of them all in Brave New World, because of just the irony of his name, the John the Savage. So the idea here is that he is different from the civilized society, growing up on the savage reservation, that he is, different, that he's sort of less human, right? Because when we typically use these words, savage or civilized, and they have so many negative connotations associated with that if we think of it historically. But the way it's used in Brave New World has this ironic undertone, because the civilized community, they see him as a savage, But in reality, when we look at it, he is more human than any of the people of the civilized community. And so the fact that he has discovered time and death and God, and he notes this as a really important moment in his life of discovering these concepts and these ideas, it's sort of the opposite of what we'd expect or what you'd assume or what you'd define a savage to be. And it's something that civilized society has not discovered. They have, conditioned their people to avoid them from discovering these concepts and from embracing, abstract things in depth. So John is actually the character who thinks the most deeply, perhaps. And we see that with Shakespeare, how he can adapt different lines to different situations and how he thinks just way more and way more broadly than any of the civilized characters. Next, we have Helmholtz, a feeling that I've got something important to say and the power to say it, only I don't know what it is and I can't. Really interesting line over here. You can really feel Helmholtz's frustration. So, obviously, he's an academic and he seems to have this mental excess that the society sort of looks down on, right? It's this ability to sort of think beyond. And he has these thoughts, so he has this feeling that there is this thought that he wants to think, that he wants to write, but he can't quite channel it because in the society there's been this conditioning, there's been this indoctrination not to think beyond what the society has conditioned you to believe in. So Helmholtz is really interesting because obviously we've got Helmholtz, John, and Bernard as the three figures who resist the society or don't fit into the civilized society in sort of the right way or as the society deems appropriate. So it's interesting to note there are different forms of rebellion, or not even a intentional form of rebellion. For Helmholtz, it's more of an unintentional rebellion because he just feels like he has this something to say, but he can't find the words for it because the society hasn't allowed those thoughts to be realized, hasn't put in place a methodology or a strategy for those thoughts to be heard in an effort to preserve the conditioning and to preserve what the system is all about. Next, we have Mustafa Mond. So, science is dangerous. We have to keep it most carefully chained and muzzled. So, as the world controller, this line is obviously said by him, and it makes a lot of sense that it would be said by him if we think about the genre of the novel being dystopia, right? A characteristic of a dystopian novel or the dystopian genre is a sense of control, and there's typically an element of science as well. But here, science being controlled is significant because in an effort to create a society where everyone is happy and pleasure is sort of central to making everyone happy, then we need to make sure, or the word controllers are going to have to make sure they restrict access to certain things like science, because that would allow people to think for themselves and that would undermine this approach to creating a civilization which is ultimately superficial, but its central component is pleasure. So while science is used in this society, right, to condition, to sleep condition, science is absolutely important. And we know that in the society, manufacturing and efficiency are also highly regarded. So science is used in that capacity, but it has to be kept away, it has to be muzzled, it has to be carefully chained when it comes to advancing human thought, or in their sort of version of it, in the world controller's version, science needs to be kept away in order to preserve the happiness of the people. Next, we have Linda. And so remember, Linda is John's mother, and she comes from the civilized society, but she gives birth to John and lives for a period of time in a savage reservation. In spite of his mother's senility and the extreme repulsiveness of her appearance, the savage frequently goes to see her and appears to be much attached to her. So, interesting thing about Linda is that she is constantly referred to by her appearance, and everyone is in the civilized society is really shocked and disgusted at her appearance because in the society they've sort of eradicated the effects of old age. So people look youthful, and so Linda does not look youthful. She sort of looks her age, having been on the savage reservation for a long time. And so we can see the superficiality of the society. They don't consider human relationships to be that bonding, right? It's just sort of having a relationship in order to get the pleasure from it, but it's not really deep. And John and Linda's relationship is incredibly deep, this mother-son relationship that we would associate with sort of our world, right? And so no matter how she looks and no matter how, far gone she is, because she's been struggling so much and she's close to death at this point, Bernard and the civilized society are absolutely sort of taken with how John keeps going to see her and really cares about her and has this real connection to her. So once again, the irony over there of civilized society supposedly not having these deep human connections and this sort of savage understanding of what these human relationships are, and that caring for someone despite their appearance and not just seeing someone as a superficial way to get pleasure is something that's seen as being uncivilized. The next character we have is the director. So that is the secret of happiness and virtue, liking what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at that, making people like their unescapable social destiny. So when giving the tour of the hatchery as early as chapter 1, already this theme of fate versus free will is introduced into the novel. So the way that the civilization creates or produces its citizens and its people is in a very uniform way, a very sort of inhumane way, very scientific approach. And the idea is that they control how much oxygen the fetus has access to so that it will produce people in different castes, in different classes of society. And the conditioning that goes along with that oxygen sort of deprivation or giving access to oxygen, the conditioning that goes along with that is designed to make people happy with their class in society so that they don't question it and that they grow up to just follow in what they need to do and fulfill the job in society that they are supposed to do. So that's what the director says, and it's something that's going to link to a lot of the themes that we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. But what we are already seeing is that in the society, the individual isn't really valued. It's more about the community. It's all about how the individual contributes to the society instead of the importance of the individual, because we can see here that each individual has an unescapable social destiny, which I think if we contrast to our modern world, or what we really treasure is the fact that we as individuals have this understanding, or have hopefully this ability to create our own destiny and to shape our own future. And so in the society, we see the contrast, we see the element of dystopia where we have the individual only being seen as part of a group, not as something that's important by itself. Right, so moving on to our first theme now, dystopia, the failure of idealism. The world state's motto, community, identity, stability. No wonder those poor pre-moderns were mad and wicked and miserable. Their world didn't allow them to take things easily, didn't allow them to be sane, virtuous, happy. You couldn't have lowercase people wasting the community's time with the books, and that there was always the risk of their reading something which might undesirably decondition one of their reflexes. A love of nature keeps no factories busy. It was decided to abolish the love of nature, at any rate among the lower classes, to abolish the love of nature, but not the tendency to consume transport. So remember, the whole idea of the genre of dystopia is that there is this grand idea, and it is going to take away all the problems of current society, and it's going to streamline everything and make everyone happy. But then that creates supposedly this utopia, but we know that utopias don't really last. Idealism is not realistic, and so there's a flaw in that plan or in that creation of the society that ultimately leads to an element of humanity, a very integral and important element of what makes us human, what we consider to be important in regards to humanity, is taken away. So there are many different aspects of dystopia in Brave New World. One of the ones that really comes to the forefront for me when I'm reading this novel and when I'm analyzing it is, like we were talking about earlier, this idea of the individual being inconsequential within the understanding of the community being absolutely important. So we can see over here the world state's motto, this new society's motto, community, identity, stability. So they are finding their identity within the community and within what they can contribute. Their identity is fundamentally based on their caste, not on their individuality. It's based on what they can provide for the community, and ultimately, it's all about keeping that stability. But if you think about in keeping that stability, there's going to be some things that are going to be lost. And so one of the most important things that is lost is free will, is the idea to think for yourself, is the idea to create your own destiny. Because in this society, we have these rules, or we have this conditioning that is going to psychologically manipulate people into believing and into actually, acting and performing according to their certain case requirements. So without them having free thought or the ability to change their fate or to change their destiny. And obviously, a lot about changing the society and developing a utopia or dystopia comes with that indoctrination, or comes with some sort of propaganda. So we see over here, no wonder those poor pre-moderns were mad and wicked and miserable. The world didn't allow them to take things easily. So we see in this society, it's all about taking things easily. It's about being happy. It's about enjoying pleasure. But if we think about what makes us human, right? And yes, if you think about we are not just consumed all with happiness these days, right? And we're sort of these pre-moderns that this quote is sort of talking about. But if we didn't have all the sadness and all the melancholy and all the anger that we do sometimes feel, then we wouldn't actually be able to experience happiness in the same sort of definition. And so that's just something interesting to think about with dystopia, because dystopia or utopia aims to eliminate all negativity. But without having some negativity, positivity can't really be enjoyed. We see in this society, everyone is supposedly happy, right? And that's a quote that's going to come up later as well. Everyone's supposedly happy, everyone's supposedly having a great time, because no one feels any negativity, right? They just take so much to deal with that. But ultimately, that creates a superficial society, because that happiness cannot be sort of true happiness, because negativity has never been dealt with and has never been overcome in order to achieve that happiness. And so then we also see over here this conditioning and this manipulation and indoctrination, and there's that sort of scene where we see all of the people having a tour of the hatchery come, and they see lowercase children and babies being conditioned against enjoying nature, so having a negative connotation with that, negative association, because ultimately that doesn't help the community. They're supposed to be manufacturing, they're supposed to be in factories, so why would we want them to have the ability to read beyond that and to think more? Why would we want them to have the ability to be enjoying nature, or to be finding a connection with nature? So once again, it's the community over the individual. And then importantly, not the tendency to consume transport. So we want to make sure that these people, well, the director of the hatchery is trying to make sure that the babies that they are producing, or the citizens that they are conditioning, are not going to like nature, because that's not going to contribute to the community and efficiency and progress. At any rate, it's going to be consuming transport, about being in the factories. So conditioning people, they don't feel like they want to revolt. They don't reject what job they have been given, what role they have been given in society. So we can see dystopia linked to individuality, but also linked to control, and linked to the community being more important almost than the individual. And then we have our next theme, loss of individuality. Standard men and women in uniform batches, the whole of a small factory staffed with the products of a single Bokanovsky-fied egg. 12 of them ready to be made one, waiting to come together, to be fused, to lose their 12 separate identities into a larger being. So here we see the role of science within creating this dystopia is basically engineering numerous sets of twins, so that everyone is produced in uniform batches. And if we think about back to Bernard, that's why we see that inferiority complex coming into his character, because he's not uniform like everyone else. So everyone else is made to look the same, depending on your caste, obviously, but there's this uniformity which leads to efficiency, but also leads to a lack of individuality, because the individual is not recognized or is not appreciated, is not held in high esteem in the society. And And then this last quote is referring to the Solidarity Service, which everyone in the world state must attend once a week, where 12 people are sort of fused into one identity. And so that's once again showing us that individuality is not something that is important within the society. It's actually something that they are trying to stamp out. They are trying to rather focus on the larger community as a whole, and that's their method, one of their methods of maintaining control and ultimately embodying or ultimately indoctrinating people into this lifestyle of pleasure and happiness. But as we know, that's a sort of superficial version of that. Next, we have the cost of happiness. That is the secret of happiness and virtue, liking what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at that, making people like their unescapable social destiny. There is always soma, delicious soma. Christianity without tears, that's what soma is. So this is quite an important theme. What is the cost of the happiness in the society? So the world state has, made happiness its central component, right? Its central feature. But in getting to that point, there are things that have had to be sacrificed. For example, free will, right? So conditioning comes into place to ensure that everyone is always going to be happy and always going to be, always going to just everything's going to be fine. There's going to be no negativity, but there's going to sacrifice that free will. And we're going to have conditioning being a central tenet of producing citizens in this society. Soma is a way to escape, right? It's a way to actually, whenever you're experiencing something slightly negative, that's the only way these people know how to deal with it, is taking these drugs to make sure they don't feel that way. And then I really like this quote over here: Christianity without tears, that's what Soma is. Because ultimately, Soma allows people not to feel accountable for their emotions, right? In the society, people cannot deal with negative emotions. They just have to take Soma to deal with that. So it's this idea of without tears, of just pacifying people, just feeding them Soma. They don't have to actually feel anything real, feel anything negative, feel anything different. That goes against their conditioning, or that goes against the central tenet of happiness. Industrialization, consumerism, consumption, and materialism. So making 96 human beings grow where only one grew before. The principle of mass production at last applied to biology. The conscription of consumption. Westminster Abbey cabaret. Ending is better than mending. So ultimately, this society is based on the ideas of mass production, right? We constantly hear Ford. We know that the year is measured by after Ford. So this links to the real life story of how mass production started, or the assembly line started with Ford cars. And that is, a cornerstone of our current society and how production and manufacturing runs, but also of this society. But in this dystopia, obviously our author has taken it sort of further than what it has in current society. So imagine a world where we have mass production linked to biology. So not just to manufacturing things, but to manufacturing people. So we can see how that quote also links to that theme of dystopia. So in the society, consumerism and consumption are absolutely key, because that is how the society keeps on generating, because it is an industrial society. So the idea of ending is better than mending. Instead of trying to fix something that's broken, the idea in the society and the world state is trying to condition its people, its citizens, is to rather throw it out and to get something new, to really revel in materialism and in consumption, because in consuming, that is how the society generates, because it is fixated on industrialization and consumption and consumerism. And then I really like this really small detail, but Westminster Abbey cabaret. And this really shows the deterioration of the morality in this supposedly civilized world in this dystopian future, because Westminster Abbey obviously is associated with Christianity, with holiness, with morality, and now it's turned into a cabaret, which has sort of the opposite connotations, all about entertainment and pleasure. And so having these, Westminster Abbey cabaret, it's almost like an oxymoron, it's a contradiction. But we see how this society has descended. They don't have morality anymore. They don't have, they don't value things or even value individuals. It's all about industrialization and materialism and consumerism. And so we can see it linked to dystopia in the way that the author is perhaps trying to warn us of what can happen if we are just fixated on pleasure and being in the moment and being in the present, as opposed to thinking about the past, thinking about the future, thinking about morality and about individuality and about what it really truly means to be human. Science and ethics, sleep teaching. Al Ford's first tea model was put on the market. Here the director made a sign of the tea on his stomach and all the students reverently followed suit. Truth's a menace. Science is a public danger. So here we are forced to sort of contemplate this really big question, which I think is a really current question. So as much as this book was written quite a number of years ago, it's still a very topical discussion of the relationship between science and ethics. So ethics is a set of moral principles of things that we believe to be right or wrong. And so how can science be applied to our society in an ethical way? And is the world state applying science in an ethical way is the question. So we have the sleep teaching, right? We have this conditioning that happens. So using scientific research about how to condition people to believe certain things or to do certain things, but now using it as people sleep when they have no control over getting this conditioning or not getting this conditioning, not sort of having an opt-out clause to this, but having it as a sort of prerequisite to forming a part of the society, right? Because this is done at the hatcheries. And Al Ford's first tea model was put on the market. So like we spoke about in the previous slide about industrialization, that's what this is all based on, this real life event on about Ford creating this assembly line and changing mass production forever. And then we also see the reverence that they have for Ford, and they call him Al Ford, which shows us that they really do revere him, really do honor and respect him, because it's by his principles of mass production that not only their production and their industry works, but also even how they are created and how they are brought into the world. And then truth's a menace, science is a public danger. So whenever you hear something along these lines, and this is something that I think we see in a lot of dystopian novels, but even we hear it, just living in the world, we hear it in current affairs. So whenever there's this claim that truth is a problem, truth can be punishing, or truth can be dangerous, or science can be dangerous, then we've really got to consider and we've got to think about the ethical role of science, but also who is in control of science, who is in control of truth, how is it perhaps being manipulated, what even is truth anymore. Appearance versus reality. That second dose of soma had raised a quite impenetrable wall between the actual universe and their minds. Bottled, they crossed the street. Bottled, they took the lift to Henry's room on the 28th floor. This idea of appearance versus reality really comes into a lot of novels, a lot of plays. This is a very common theme. And applied to this novel, I think this quote really encapsulates it a lot, especially with this word bottled, because these people are so reliant on soma. What actually is happening versus what's happening in their heads, there's this difference, but ultimately they don't really seem to care about that difference, and they live in this sort of made-up reality where they don't have to experience any negativity. And so here we have Lennon and Henry having a night out and then ultimately going up to his room, but they are so consumed in their soma, or in this pretended, or this reality that they've generated for themselves, that, the true reality, as it says, like the actual universe and their minds, are at odds. And so we get to maybe see, maybe there's some problem with the society, or maybe the society is, not as airtight as it may seem, because people are not actually seeing the reality of things. They're stuck in a made-up appearance of things. Fate or determinism versus free will. So fate or determinism, this idea of your destiny being written in the stars, you can't change anything, this is how your life is going to be, versus free will is the idea that you have a choice, that your choices determine your destiny, determine your future, determine your life. Till at last the child's mind is these suggestions, and the sum of the suggestions is the child's mind. And not the child's mind only, the adult's mind too, all his life long, the mind that judges and desires and decides, made up of these suggestions. But all these suggestions are our suggestions. We proceed to rub in the lesson with a mild electric shock. They've had at least 250,000 warnings against solitude. So in this society, fate and determinism are central. Free will is essentially wiped out. And if a character, like we saw Bernard, thinking a little bit in terms of free will, thinking for himself slightly, like Helmholtz as well, we know there are consequences to thinking that way. And it's not supposed to be like that. It's not normal. And so here we see that this society generates and produces its citizens from when they are just being created, just when they're a child. They are conditioning them. They are making them believe things. And so ultimately, when they go into the world, they have a bank of thoughts, and they only choose thoughts from those suggestions that have been suggested to them. They cannot think for themselves beyond that bank of suggestions or those bank of thoughts that have been delivered to them through this conditioning and sleep teaching. And so we see also the way that they will not stop at anything to condition people and to make them think of certain things. And obviously the excuse is, well, this is what's going to make people happy, right? If we just give them a certain bank of suggestions, we don't let them think for themselves, they're going to contribute positively to society, they're going to feel really happy, they're going to take soma. So that's the excuse, that's the reasoning supposedly, or the justification for it. But they're willing to rub in the lesson with a mild electric shock. And then we can just see the scale in this last quote. They've had at least 250,000 warnings against solitude. So all these people have millions or thousands and so many times being reminded of these things through this conditioning that there's no possible way they could be thinking for themselves or thinking against what they've been conditioned to believe. And this particular example is against solitude, right? Against being alone. Because remember, for the society to function and to do well and to embrace the central tenets of the world state, it's all about community. It's not about the individual. Choice and freedom versus conditioning and stability. She was appalled by the rushing emptiness of the night. I don't understand anything, she said with decision, determined to preserve her incomprehension intact. You're claiming the right to be unhappy. The right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. Because our world is not the same as Othello's world. You can't make slivers without steel, and you can't make tragedies without social instability. The world's stable now. People are happy. They get what they want, and they never want what they can't get. They're well off. They're safe. They're never ill. They're not afraid of death. They're blissfully ignorant of passion and old age. They're plagued with no mothers or fathers. They've got no wives or children or lovers to feel strongly about. They're so conditioned that they practically can't help behaving as they ought to behave. And if anything should go wrong, there's Soma. So this first line is referring to Lenina, and it's when Bernard is in the helicopter and he's talking about the night and looking, beyond into the emptiness of the night and reveling in it. And she's absolutely appalled by the fact that this night is so empty, and she feels really uncomfortable by this. And so we can see here the significance of conditioning and how Bernard is trying to sort of think out of the box, and he's trying to oppose his conditioning and reject it. But Lenina is stuck in her conditioning, and she doesn't see anything good about this. She doesn't see anything relaxing or calming or even beautiful about the emptiness of the night, because she's been conditioned to believe that this is not something to seek out, that rather you need to seek out being with other people, being, surrounded by others, being surrounded by pleasure, not by the emptiness of the night, and not by finding perhaps beauty in nature. I don't understand anything, she said with decision determined to preserve it in comprehension intact. This was actually, we had this quote already in a previous slide, but this is Lenina's sort of predisposition to her conditioning and her desire to keep that intact and not wanting to think beyond that. The next three quotes come into play when the world controller Mustafa Mond is talking with John the Savage towards the end of the book, and they're talking about all things, that what makes us human, what makes a civilized society versus a savage reservation, what are the central tenets of life that are important to hold on to. And so they're having this conversation. And so Mustafa says to him, "You're claiming the right to be unhappy." Because John has been complaining and struggling to come to terms with how this civilized society is governed and how it's run and how these people are so superficial and how they are just permanently sort of in the state of there's one feeling of being happy and they just take soma. And so Mustafa is trying to put in a different way for him, different words for him, and says, "You're claiming the right to be unhappy," which sounds like a ridiculous question, but we can say that is essentially what John is saying. He does want to have the right to be unhappy, because without that, if you are conditioned and if you're just living in this stable life and you're always happy, you're not having any sort of choice, any sort of insight, any sort of ability to think or to believe. You don't have that freedom of choice. And so then he takes to the next level and he talks about all the negative things that this society has cancelled out. This society has made sure that their community that does not have to suffer. Their citizens do not ever grow old and ugly. They are not going to have syphilis and cancer. They're not going to have apprehension of what's going to happen tomorrow. Apprehension is like this sort of mixture between nervousness and excitement. They're not going to catch typhoid. They're not going to be tortured, and they're not going to have any unspeakable pains. They're not going to experience pain or suffering in any way, shape, or form. And so John is saying, hold on, he actually appreciates having the right to do all these things, even though there's something negative about them, even though they're the worst aspects of humanity, right? The worst things, the things that we fear. Not having the ability to have the freedom of choice or the freedom to actually experience these things, and just being conditioned to experience one thing is something that he's really struggling with, he's fighting against. So in the society, we see that conditioning and stability have been prioritized over choice and freedom. And then we get into this comparison with Othello. And we're obviously, you know the story of Othello because it's actually, well, if you're doing this book and you're an IEB student, then Othello is your Shakespeare this year as well. So I think it's interesting to bring in this quote about Othello because you are aware of what Othello is all about. But it's not really that much about Othello, but it's about the real world. So Othello is set in sort of a real world context, right? Where there are good people, there are bad people, there's manipulation, there is jealousy, there are all these negative aspects of humanity. But what Mustafa Mond is saying is that you cannot compare Othello with the world state. You cannot compare the real world, or the world that we live in now, to the world state, because in our world and in Othello's world, there is instability. And because of instability, all these other things can manifest. But the world state claims to be stable now. So people are always happy. There is never going to be an uprising. There's never going to be someone disagreeing with someone else. There's always going to be safety. There's not going to be sickness. So instability has been eradicated. And therefore, all of those emotions and all of those beliefs and all of those choices that we have, or that in Othello's world they don't have it in the world state. They don't have all those problems because they have this ultimate stability. And like it says in the second part of the quote, they've got no wives or children or lovers to feel strongly about. They have no mothers or fathers. So in a world of instability, like our world or Othello's world, there is going to be jealousy, there is going to be manipulation, there is going to be, some negative things, because we have something that we feel really strongly about, right? If you think about our world, we care about the people around us, our friends, our family. And so then, yes, we are going to feel sad sometimes. We are going to feel really depressed when they're going through something that's rough. We are going to feel protective over them when we feel like they're in danger or feel like someone else is taking them away from us. We are going to feel these sort of negative things, these things that we don't like to feel. But the reason why we feel that is because we really care about them and we really feel strongly about them and we really love them. So we can see there's sort of two sides to the coin over here of, if you are going to have these beautiful things like love and have these strong connections and human relationships, it also comes with the negativity. And that creates an unstable society, right? Because we don't know how people are going to react. We know people are going to react differently. We know that some people are going to be feeling really good in a moment, some people are going to be feeling really bad. In the world state, they've taken away that option, right? They've taken away that freedom. So we don't have people that we feel really strongly about. There's no such things as mothers and fathers. They are conditioned to be happy and to behave according to how they need to behave. They don't have strong connections, strong individual connections to anyone. And in that way, they are protected from all these negative associations or negative emotions that come into play when you are strongly connected to people or when you're in touch with your humanity. And if anything should go wrong, don't worry, there's Soma to take it away, to drown out any sort of negativity, so you're in this permanent state of superficial happiness. Next, we have superficiality versus depth. So everybody's happy now. I'm free to have the most wonderful time. Everybody's happy nowadays. Getting rid of everything unpleasant instead of learning to put up with it. Mental excess. So everybody's happy now, and I'm free to have the most wonderful time. Everybody's happy nowadays. This is the conditioning coming into play. Everyone in the society and the world state believes that they are free because they are happy, and so they put these two notions side by side. But ultimately, as we've discussed, these are superficial. These are not actual. It's not really happiness in terms of our definition of happiness, right? It is a superficial version of it because there isn't any negativity to balance it out. And in the society, like we've said, they've got rid of everything unpleasant. Instead of learning to put up with it, instead of learning to deal with it or to overcome it, as John reflects, they've just got rid of it all. So there's only happiness, there's only positivity. And mental excess, we spoke about when we speak about Helmholtz, this idea that he's thinking sort of a bit too much, and that could be problematic because that is going to, if he's going to think deeper, then it's going to push the balance, and it's going to jeopardize, it could potentially jeopardize this sort of happy state that everyone's in. Humanity, the notion of civilization, and dehumanization. No air, no space, an under-sterilized prison, darkness, disease, and smells. And home was as squalid psychically as physically. Psychically, it was a rabbit hole, a midden, hot with the frictions of tightly packed life, reeking with emotion. To say one was a mother, that was past the joke. It was an obscenity. Civilization has absolutely no need of nobility or heroism. These things are symptoms of political inefficiency. So in the society, we've spoken about humanity versus this process of dehumanization, because when you have this notion of civilization that is introducing something superficial or a superficial version of what reality needs to be, then we are seeing that what we hold to be central tenets of humanity, and that obviously is going to differ for every person, right? What they feel like is a central tenet. But in our modern society, what we have, if we think about what humanity means to us, it's having all these emotions, it's having nobility, having heroism, having emotions. And then in this society, we see there's a process of dehumanization in order to retain stability. So these first two quotations are describing the home and home life. And so it's a really interesting way to describe it. Obviously, there's a lot of really negative words here, really negative diction. I mean, comparing it to an under-sterilized prison, darkness, disease, and smells, to a midden, which is sort of a rubbish dump. And this is talking about this outdated version in terms of the world state of what a home is. So I know to me, a home has a very different connotation, right? I would think of home as being really warm, really comforting, like a sanctuary filled with the people that I love. But in the world state, the propaganda and the conditioning has made people believe in this pre-modern era, the home was something absolutely disgusting because it was filled with all these human relationships. And that's something that in this society, human relationships are not seen as something that's full of depth, right? Not seen as something like that, but rather seen as superficial, just to get pleasure out of that relationship and then be on your way and move on. So moving to the third quote, to say that one was a mother, that was past a joke, it was an obscenity. In the society, they've completely done away with those connections to people, and that what we find or what we think is true sense of humanity, of having a mother, or having a connection, or having a mother figure. And so those deeply rooted connections within our society that we really put on a high level, we put on a high pedestal. In the society, it's the complete opposite. They've done away with that in an effort to be efficient and in an effort to have a stable life, because ultimately having those deep relationships with people does create a sense of instability, because what happens if that person decides to do something different to what you expected? What if they go away? Then you're left with all these negative emotions. And then lastly, we have this sort of explanation of that this civilization does not need nobility or heroism. They don't need a hero figure like we have in Shakespeare, right? When we have this hero figure who goes against the system, because nobility and heroism are symptoms of political inefficiency. You would only have nobility or heroism if you can contrast it with villainy, with someone doing something negative, with something being inefficient. And so, in the society, because it is stable, because it is efficient, or it claims to be that way, there isn't anyone who's going to be noble or heroic or different. Because, firstly, we're wiping out individuality in the world state, but secondly, there's no need for it because everything's stable and everything's good, so everything just runs smoothly. There's nothing to go up against. Therefore, nobility and heroism fade, and they become non-existent. Pleasure and pain. After those weeks of idleness in London, with nothing to do, whenever he wanted anything but to press a switch or turn a handle, it was pure delight to be doing something that demanded skill and patience, to escape further contamination by the filth of civilized life, hitting himself with a whip of knotted cords, orgy of atonement. So these quotes are all referring to John the Savage of after his experience in civilized London, and he craves a different lifestyle, and he goes to stay in this abandoned lighthouse, and he is so excited to actually be doing things and physically actually acting, even though it's hard work, even though it's hard labor that he's doing. He is appreciative of it because after weeks and weeks in a civilized society where you just have to press a button, there is no pain. It's just pure pleasure. It's just really convenient. Convenience is key in this civilized society of the world state. He actually demands something, or he requires something, or he really treasures this physical work that he's doing, something that requires skill and patience, and is actually, he feels more connected to himself, connected to nature, connected to his humanity, of actually doing something instead of just pressing a button. And he looks towards actually the extreme because of how he has been conditioned in the savage reserve is through this idea of sacrifice, right? And through this idea of experiencing pain in order to feel good about oneself or to feel morally at ease. So to escape this filth of civilized life, he starts hitting himself with this whip of knotted cords in order to try and atone for all the pleasure that he's sort of reveled in, well, not entirely reveled in, but that he's been exposed to and has been sort of brainwashed by after his time in London. And so we see this complete shift. And this is why when the news agencies all come, they're just fascinated by John because he seems to pursue something that they've been conditioned not to pursue. He's pursuing pain. And so we can see that pain is so heavily associated with humanity then. And so something else that the world state doesn't have is it doesn't have this link to pain. It doesn't have any suffering. And so that's why these people are fascinated by it. And so you need to be thinking then to yourself, what is humanity, and is humanity linked to pain or linked to pleasure or linked to both? What is a truly whole person? Is it someone who can experience only pleasure, someone who can experience only pain, or is it this combination of pleasure and pain? The role of knowledge and the focus on the present. There were those strange rumors of old forbidden books hidden in a safe in the controller's study. Bibles, poetry, Ford knew what. Our library, said Dr. Gaffney, contains only books of reference. If our young people need distraction, they can get it at the Feelies. We don't encourage them to indulge in any solitary amusements. So the role of knowledge in the society, similar to our discussion of science, is it has its place, and knowledge and science are used in order to manufacture people, in order to create efficiency and stability within society, but no excess of knowledge needs to be exposed to the people. So there are old forbidden books that are locked up. When books become something that needs to be locked up, we really recognize this as a tenet of dystopian fiction, because it's the idea that books hold this knowledge that can make people think for themselves, and that could be dangerous to the world state and could threaten this stability that they've worked so hard to ensure. And the focus on the present, we can see it over here, is why would they want people thinking back to history? Why would they want people studying the past? Why would they want people focusing even on the future? You only, in the world state, they would want people to only focus on the present because they are, conditioning them to pursue superficial pleasures that are going to be enjoyed in the present, that are not necessarily going to be remembered. They are focusing on the superficial physicality of a person instead of making them or wanting them to think beyond that. So wanting them to think of what the world could be or what the world was, and to make critical, decisions, or have critical thoughts about the role of the past, the role of the future. So a people are quite more controllable if they're only focusing on the present than if they have knowledge of the past and the future, and if they have insight and the ability to critically think. And lastly, rebellion against totalitarianism. But I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. So this is what John says towards the end of the novel, once he's experienced both life in the savage reservation and also in the civilized world state. And he wants a life against totalitarianism, against a centralized society where everyone has to serve one particular version of reality. And he rebels by saying that he wants to feel things that are negative. He wants a God. He wants someone to believe in. He wants poetry. He wants beauty, but he also wants danger. He wants freedom. He wants goodness. He wants sin. He wants to be in control of how he lives his life, of what his destiny is going to be, even if that encompasses negativity. This is what he strives to live. This is what he finds after his experiences to be what the ideal is for him, the life that he truly wants to live. So here we can see his rebellion against totalitarianism is that he rejects this idea of this sterile, superficial world. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you found that video helpful. Please let me know in the comments if you would like any more videos on Brave New World and what content you'd like me to cover in those videos. Please remember to like the video and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.